this evening for the relationship is the project A Panel discussion with these excellent folks who I'll introduce in a moment. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're gathering today and pay respects to elders past and present, to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to pay respects to any First Nations people in the room and to all of the First Nations artists and cultural workers who work with us in this industry every single day. And remind us all actually that First Nations people are the first artists, the first storytellers, the first creators of culture, content, translating content into stories of songlines. And what an incredible legacy it is to be able to say we sort of work and think and write and be in this space with this extraordinary cultural guidance. I'd like to introduce my fellow panel members, but friends, colleagues, excellent collaborators. I'm Tania Canas, Dr Ruth De Souza and Adolfo Aranjuez, who have all contributed to the first edition. Dr Tania Canas. What are they doing, Doctor?
Jade, are you a doctor as well?
We're double. Are you a doctor too?
I know.
I'm not a doctor.
That's why we're on the outside.
We're here to support the doctors, to hold the doctors up.
Truth comes out.
It's our job. And I guess know these extraordinary people through a range of places and ways, but probably met through Footscray Community Arts, sort of between the 2012 to 2017 era when I was there. Very lucky to be there as the director and CEO. We are not going to do those sort of lengthy introductions tonight. We're going to try a new format. So, I don't know about anybody else, but I do a bit of a cringe when people start to read out a bio. But we're going to hear from each of these wonderful people as they read a little bit from their chapters and tell you a little bit about themselves and why they wrote that particular thing and what it meant to them at the time. Before I go on, I'd like to also say thank you to Colette Brennan, who's hosting us tonight, the Abbotsford Convent, to Kenny, to all the people who've helped make this possible for us, and to Olivia Allen from the City of Yarra, who gave us this invitation initially, and thanks so much. I think it's probably been in the making for a couple of years now. Maybe we had COVID in between, but time, what is time? Thanks again. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Adolfo actually, who's going to read first and tell us a bit about himself, and we'll talk a bit about the book throughout. We'll ask a few questions. There'll be some moments for Q&A at the end, and then we thought you might want to finish off with a little hangout together, a little bit of an informal opportunity to chat. Over to you.
Hi. I'm reading the edited version, slightly updated from the version in that book, so this is the first time you're getting an exclusive peek. It's not that different. I'm just finding you out. This is why you're getting me to read first, because of my charmed, reading first, talking after. Diversity box ticking in quarters can easily lead to a scramble for individuals expected to speak court on behalf of the entire community. Even if by accident this paints a complex group with the same simplistic brush. In the end, this is a hollow gesture that only gives the appearance of representation. No minority group is made up of carbon copies of the same person. Experiences of inequality can also differ if a person lives with intersecting types of disadvantage. Diversity exists not just between communities, for instance, LGBTQIA+ people versus straight people, but also within them, cisgender gay men versus non-binary trans queers. The people in these groups have individual values, dreams, and perspectives, and their obstacles to success can vary. By relying on just a single so-called representative, newer voices or different perspectives can be drowned out. In the best case scenario, minorities will self-represent through projects run by their own community or headed by them within a mainstream organization. This isn't about forming ghettos within the arts, with group members only making work with and for that group, but rather about achieving representation that is truly empowering. Outsiders to the group can still enjoy the work, but that work will be more authentic, as it is community-led. We also often rely on percentages to assess how representative we're being. Mainly we do this by comparing the composition of hired creators against population figures. Percentages offer a helpful lens for kickstarting discussion, but we can't rely on the numbers game, which reduces people to statistics using a single metric. For instance, a person from anywhere in Asia counts as Asian, ignoring cultural differences across the continent or other identity markers like gender or class. On one hand, statistics can give us quick and easy snapshots of areas we can improve. On the other, they can trick us into thinking we've reached solutions when numbers simply go up. A percentage increase, like a box in a checklist, gives the sense of an end point. In terms of representation, we end up asking simply, have we included X group? And aiming for the answer, yes. But numbers only show a small part of a big picture. As they neglect intersectional factors, they don't tell us about in-group diversity or longer-term change. So why did I write that? Oh my gosh. Well, as you can see, because of who I am as a person, the term that I use is multiple minority. And I've written about this heaps. If you head to my website, adolfoaranjuez.com, head to the writing tab, 2017? Around the time that I met Jade, actually, which is probably why I ended up in this book. I was writing a lot about what has been called the Oppression Olympics, where people kind of had bastardized the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality and turned it into a way of tallying people's oppressions. And as someone multiply marginalized, multiply oppressed, I am brown, queer, mentally ill, a migrant, what else?
Excellent.
I was young at the time, not so much now. She's an old fart, but back then in my 20s. And so those things kind of meant that I was often the person that was the go-to. I was so easily hired for things, and also because I was practiced in appearing in front of an audience and delivering work to schedule on time, almost perfectly. Which, by the way, is a mode of survival, right? For anyone who is oppressed, marginalized, you perfect that stuff. You perfect performance, you perfect delivering work to a high standard to survive in mainstream contexts. And so the part that I did read from my chapter actually talks about stepping aside and giving space, or making space for other people, and not just making space in the way that we use now about saying no, but literally making space. So since then my jobs have evolved from editing film magazines, editing Archer, the sexuality and gender magazine, to now working with Liminal, which is an anti-racist literary platform, to working at MIF, the film festival, doing audience development work, bringing people into the festival, creating spaces, literally creating spaces, and hopefully tearing down barriers. So I don't do as much as myself now. Maybe that's good. Maybe somehow I've managed to convince people that it's not good to hire the same old person, even though they're amazing, obviously. Sometimes hire them occasionally, like for today. Because there are multiple kinds of these people, multiple versions of these people that we often kind of lump together in the same group in discussions of representation and identity. Yeah, is that what you wanted? Right. Tick.
Hi everybody. Thanks for making it out here. It's evening and winter and you've had big days, so really appreciate all your lovely, warm, interested faces. I'm very interested in the process of acknowledgement, and thanks for the acknowledgement, Jade. And I also want to ask whether it's enough. We acknowledge that land has been stolen, then what is our corresponding obligation to clarify how we will account for, change, or do something about this thievery? Or are we merely saying, I stole the land, but I'm keeping it? So this is something I'm thinking about a lot. So my plan with my allotted time, which is the whole 2 hours, not, just joking.
We love you.
Just jokes. My plan is to read from the chapter, from the old version, because it's still being.
What about that?
No, it's good. It's really good. And then instead of talking about what I've done, I'm going to just read some reflections about how we might teach cultural safety, because that's something that's I've thought about for only 30 years and I'm still thinking about it. So that's my plan. Yeah? So, where does cultural safety come from? I'm a nurse, by the way. The term was taken up by the Nursing Council of New Zealand in 1992 in response to advocacy from Māori nurses, in particular Ire Hapiti Ramsden. Nurses wanted to make sure the cultural identities of Māori were respected by health professionals and organisations that were knowingly and or unknowingly biased towards non-Indigenous people and practices. I think that should say, Indigenous people and practices. According to the Nursing Council of New Zealand, cultural safety now refers to both an ethical framework and its intended outcome, in which the person delivering a service will have undertaken a process of reflection on their own cultural identity and will recognise the impact that their personal culture has on their professional practice. Culture includes, but is not restricted to, age or generation, gender, sexual orientation, occupation, socioeconomic status, ethnic origin, migrant experience, religious or spiritual belief, and disability. Unsafe cultural practice comprises any action which diminishes, demeans, or disempowers the cultural identity and well-being of an individual. So in the book, Robin Higgins and I write, when we build upon this idea in non-health related contexts, it's important to be respectful and recognise cultural safety's history and original intent. Cultural safety is an Indigenous people's approach, strengthened by over 25 years of development. Since its development in nursing, it has been used in different professions and countries and has had strong support from First Nations peoples in Aotearoa, Canada, America and Australia. I might stop there and encourage you to read more, but I wondered if I could just talk about why cultural safety is so important to me. So, I have a lot of bullet points. Jade, just come and kick me if I'm talking too long, okay? Or gently tap me. So, apart from my living and lived experiences, I'm passionate about the how of teaching cultural safety. And often this happens in universities, which are both colonial sites and places of transformation. They're neoliberal universities characterised by reduced funding, audit culture, competition for research findings, and increased workforce precarity, challenging the capacity to do much more than reproduction. Nursing/art programs located in universities experience all the strictures of the neoliberal university and are implicated in reproducing colonial legacy inequalities in the curriculum factory. Nurses/artists, whoever you are in this group, internalise and then reproduce the norms and culture of their professions unless interrupted. Hence, how nurses/artists are socialised through the curriculum has critical implications for how they later practice. As an educator, I believe that developing students' understandings of cultural safety must be a deliberate, consciousness-developing, transformative experience. It must open students up to the potential of doing things differently. It cannot be left to chance, something that can be acquired later in the so-called real world. I'm going to skip some bullet points, but maybe just say a few words about teaching cultural safety while being unsafe. There's a really nice kind of analogy of teaching into a headwind. In the academy, people of colour are meant to know their place, while Indigenous people are not supposed to even be present. Teaching an always already marginalised subject using disruptive approaches while a minoritised scholar is like teaching into a headwind. Attempting to out-teach the imposition of racialised ideas is impossible. Undoing racism is slow, painstaking, intergenerational work. Preparing students to interrogate and challenge normative or purportedly neutral systems and structures that reproduce colonial violence exacts a cost for Indigenous and minoritised scholars who are already underrepresented. So Sarah Ahmed says, racialised staff might inhabit institutional spaces without being given residence. I'm scrolling down because I have far too many bullet points.
You look very impressive.
Thank you. So how do we make sure that the future is collectively ours when the responsibility for the work of cultural safety is unevenly distributed, devalued and displaced onto those who are trying to survive in whiteness, those who are struggling with the work of fitting in or disappearing, who are tasked with being there without really being there? High quality work, academic work, including teaching, is slow work. Time is needed to try things, to engage, to innovate, to facilitate curiosity and creativity, none of which can happen effectively in accelerated and precarious work contexts. As cultural safety becomes tamed and domesticated, we must ensure it does not lose its critical edge. I'm unconvinced that we can shift whiteness in the arts and in academia, but maybe, just maybe, by making this contribution and being part of a collection in this book, we can become a collective. This is my hope. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. And I also wanted to, thank you both for the for modelling such an incredible acknowledgement and as an example of us all to keep ourselves and each other accountable. And I'll give a little example in a second. But I just wanted to talk about how the chapter came to be before I do the reading. So it's going to be a shorter reading. But the chapter came about through kind of two streams. The first was, at the time I was working at Rise Refugee as the arts director. Rise Refugee is the first organisation to be run and governed by the refugee, asylum seeker and ex-detainee community. And as part of my work there, we just would constantly get a barrage, and I mean a daily barrage of emails saying we need an Iranian refugee for this project, we need a Sudanese refugee for this other project, and I'm talking daily, like we couldn't keep up with responding to these emails. And so I ended up, from that experience, I ended up writing a piece called 10 Points to Consider if you're an artist, not of the refugee and asylum seeker community, looking to work with our community, because what we found is that the artists were the biggest culprits. So I wrote that article, and I'm forever grateful for the learning experience at Rise Refugee. I'm no longer the arts director at Rise, but I'm an ongoing Rise member. And I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing learning from that incredible organisation that has taught me that every moment is a political and an ethical decision. And so the other stream was the Generate workshops that were happening at Footscray Arts, and I think you'll talk a little bit about that, but those were 3-hour workshops in which I was part of an incredible group of practitioners on the ground, and so the workshop that I delivered was specifically on ethics and self-determination, and so that workshop was about, I was doing a thesis at the time, so it was very much thinking through the frameworks, the embodied literature in relation to practice. It also depended who was in the room, and so we worked with examples and what people brought into the room, so it kind of changed every time, which is also great. But also acknowledging that I was very much taking from the influences from my lived experience or my context. So I was drawing a lot from literature from Latin America, aka Abalayala. And in so doing, in taking, I also have a performance background, so in taking, that liminal space of the workshop and being around others,
taking that into this published text and this published form of Volume 1, there was an oversight on my part about in which I didn't explicitly acknowledge the local power, historical struggles of self-determination of credible activists and community organisers, and this is something that I've changed for Volume 2, which is coming out soon. But in saying that, I just wanted to jump into the reading. Ethics as relational, ethics as movement. Ethics has often been associated with ideas of morality and character, understandings of good and bad or right and wrong. This universalization of ethics supposes a right way. This supposition can be defensive, divisive, and ultimately supporting of existing power dynamics, such as using the good people with good intentions excuse to justify harmful approaches. But this binary approach ignores many forms of ethics, let alone ethics that move from moment to moment, context to context, and project to project. Steering away from one-size-fits-all model of ethics can avoid such harmful helping. A unique perspective can be found in the idea of relational ethics, and I quote, "Acting ethically involves more than resolving ethical dilemmas through good moral reasoning. It demands attentiveness and responsiveness to our communities, to one another, to the earth, and to all living things." The relational approach positions ethics not as something to have or possess, but as something to be unpacked within the context of power dynamics. It asks how a project has come to exist, not just the ethics of the project itself. A useful way to interrogate ethics is to understand what it means in relation to voice, autonomy, and self-determination. Just because a community is visible, or in some cases hyper-visible, doesn't automatically mean they've had equal representation of power. Existence in the space also doesn't mean we've had autonomy by which that existence has occurred. Speech is not always autonomous. Self-expression is not the same as self-determination.
Thank you all for your kind of contributions and introductions in this sense. I guess it is useful to provide some context also for the book as my way of introducing as well. So as we've sort of talked about, the relationship with the project really came from a time in my life when I, again, was lucky to be the director at Footscray, and every week people would come to me, every week, every day, with questions. Sometimes they were questions like, what can I read? Is there something I can read that I can learn more about how to do this work with communities? And then there were varied questions like, how do I work more effectively or impactfully with First Nations communities? How do I get in touch with the refugee and asylum seeker community? What is cultural safety? What does ableism mean? And rather than answering that or attempting to for myself, because that's not necessarily appropriate or necessary in some instances, unless the person really has no clue, in which case it's my job to do a bit of work before they get to the people who actually have the lived experience. But it was an opportunity to really profile, support and collaborate with people that I really care about and respect, to share knowledge and wisdom from various perspectives in the context of this book. So essentially every chapter represents a question or a series of questions that came to me more than once and often multiple times. And then obviously working with people on what was important to say at the time. And that's really how the book came to be. And I think like any good project, in a way of showing that you've had an opportunity to really build relationships over time, this group of collaborators came together by a series of text messages. I was like, hey, I'm going to write this grant application. Do you want to do this thing? Shall we write a book together and make this happen? So when you have that kind of ease and opportunity to be in touch with people about the things that we all care about, that to me was sort of the ultimate success in some ways of being able to share this knowledge with everybody else. And at the time, thankfully, Brow Books came on board to publish, which was really exciting, and subsequently are no longer in the field, are no longer existing for a whole range of reasons, and I think they sort of ceased the day we launched this book actually here in February 2020. So it's been a bit of a journey, and I really want to thank everyone for supporting it, because we've sold out, like it's not available anymore and all of those kinds of things, but I'll talk at the end about the next one that's coming. But on your point earlier, I think one of our biggest celebrations and feelings of success with this book was when it made it onto the top 10 resources to fight white supremacy. And that was like the golden day. It was like, that's excellent, that's all we want. And I think those are the ways that we all come together to collaborate, share, and provide spaces for each other to really try and create new conversations for change, or old conversations that need to be reiterated again and again, but hopefully by people taking the opportunity to read and engage with this text or these texts, rather than necessarily having to ask people questions all the time or send an email every other day. In terms of the book itself, when people would ask if there was something they could read, honestly, all I had to refer were academic texts. And even if there were books of varying kind of degrees of success or impact, they would often come from an academic perspective, even if it was a practice one. And whilst there's absolute value in that, clearly from my doctor friends on the stage here, I love doctors. It's also really important to promote and profile the wisdom of practitioners who are the people kind of working on the ground with communities as well, who might not be working in an academic context. So it was really important to try and do that in the book as well. And since then, other people have become doctors too and shared their knowledge and information, but that was really the intent of it. Enough from me. Thank you so much for your introductions. I'd love to throw to you, Tania, actually, because in our prep chat, Tania said, you know, the relationship is the project, but not every relationship is the project. I was like, you're right, cool. Let's talk about that. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts around that and provocations.
Thanks, Jade, and thanks so much for taking that really well and providing an opportunity for us to chat through it today. And it really came out of a conversation I was having with a colleague. I have some really close friends that have been in the arts for a really long time, and I've never done a project with them. And this colleague was like, oh, you know, she was asking me what, you know, how come and why, and I sort of came to the conclusion that yes, the relationship is the project, but not every relationship needs to be a project. And it's not just a matter of this sense of protecting, but it's really a question of whether you want to expose some of these really dear relationships to a really exploitative industry. And I think of an example of two really close friends who had a friendship for a very long time. They had lived together, they knew each other's families, and they had some solid years of friendship under their belt. And then they worked on a project for an arts festival, and it almost broke that friendship. And I'm talking, like, this is not a reflection of that project, like that relationship was weak or this and that. I'm talking, this was a solid friendship, and it almost broke their friendship. And it really made me think about this question of relationships and it being projects, and thinking about the parameters of that. And it's an ongoing lesson and an ongoing question I keep asking myself. So, you know, the relationship as the project is an emphasis on the relational, but it's also not to say that you have to seek relationships for a project, because of course we see plenty of really good bad examples from refugee theatre, which you know, I think if we look historically of some productions that have happened where the practitioner from a very privileged position has gone into a detention centre, has interviewed somebody and said that they're friends, and then gone off and published something. So we're talking like, we really need to think about the asymmetry in what we decide or what we wish or what we want or what we demand to call as friendship or a relationship. And I think about that in work settings as well, when people say, oh, you know, like, we're a fam or we're a family in this workplace. Like, it gets really, a bit tricky and a bit gross, especially if we're talking about very exploitative industries. And then I think about the practitioners who refuse to expose these relationships to a very exploitative systems, and then how that practitioner in that refusal is seen as having no value whatsoever. So of course these are upon certain bodies rather than others. And so the relationship as a project is a continued invitation to think about accountability, to think about ethics, the distribution of labour, but we don't want to submit every relationship to projectification. And I know we talked about academic articles, but if I could just do, I'm just going to read 3 sentences from a piece on partitioning vulnerabilities, and I think it just summarises it really well. This is a piece, you can look it up, it's by Björnson and Kashabaras, and they write here, in the projectification of the social life of vulnerable groups, participatory designers, researchers, and stronger cultural workers submit and blend voluntary work, unpaid work, paid work, stable and unstable ways of making a living, with a hope that this might lead to a new project, another project, yet another project.
And Adolfo, there's so much we could say about that, and I guess I just want to invite the panel to jump in at any point and ask each other questions as well, however we'd like to do that. But I also think a lot about social capital, Tania, too, and how we use that in relationships, in relation to projects, and how it's really important to protect that, particularly if of a range of lived experiences. Adolfo, you talked a bit about we can't art everything, and that it's actually not really just about the art. And I wonder if you want to share some more thoughts with us about that.
Sure. Yeah, that statement came out of frustration about some very cliched lines that get bandied around a lot in creative contexts, and now kind of beyond as well. Things like, if you see it, you can be it, you know, we need to see ourselves reflected. Reflect is actually a bad word, I think. If you pause poetically, like analyze the word reflect, it's backwards, you know, it's distal anyway. But, you know, see ourselves reflected, what else? Need to be invited to the table, need to bring to the conversation. They're all quite hollow ways of referring to what is actually a very deeply rooted problem. And I think the way that we as a society address these is by finding a superficial, and by superficial I mean, you know, tangible, visible way of addressing it. So an easy way is, in a film, you change a character's race, just easily, you know, you don't change anything about their backstory, you don't change anything about the character's circumstances, you literally just cast a person of color in that role. And when that is done, it doesn't ring true. Like, as an audience member, you can sense that they've just put on a costume on a character that wasn't written authentically to have that lived experience. That's what I mean by we can't art anything. So because my background is I have many backgrounds, but one of my backgrounds is in film and screen criticism, and film in general. It's kind of very convenient to simply say, oh, this is such a racially diverse film, how wonderful. And that's what I kind of alluded to as well in the section of my piece that I read. But seeing a person of color in a role that isn't actually about a person of color, that captures that experience, that has like the authentic nuggets of, I don't know, the scent of garlic in the house, or the way that Asian parents always make you feel like you're not enough. You know, these little things, they will seep through if the writing is real, but just to have a character that isn't that, with the face of someone that is ostensibly that, superficially that, I think that's what happens a lot. And so we celebrate these fake wins without realizing that they are fake wins. And the second kind of component for that for me is the fact that art doesn't do anything. In my circles especially, so something else I do is assess grants. So that thing I talked about giving opportunities, creating spaces, etc. I kind of see through that. I see through that, and a lot of artists say that my art will change something, will do something, will make people believe in, I don't know, the importance of gender diversity, I don't know, whatever, you know, my art will do this, but it's actually not the art that does it, it's the people that do it. And I think we neglect the ways that there are scaffolding and there are infrastructures that are required to keep the people making this art, and to have conversations where people analyze the art so that it makes sense. A lot of funding, a lot of festivals, a lot of opportunities are focused on the creation of art. And this is very frustrating for me because I am often asked to assess these things. But then post the creation of the art, there are no grants, there are no opportunities for the delivery of the art, for opportunities for the artist to engage with audience members, for different types of audience members, not just the usual suspects who always go to arts events because they have free time and they have money, to even have an entry point for this art to be understood. The art itself can't teach us anything if we can't understand it, if we don't even know it exists. I guess that's kind of what I mean by art. We can't art anything. And I feel like a buzzkill saying this, because I'm an artist as well, you know, and I'd like to think that when I perform or when I write something and people chance upon my work, that they are transformed in some way. But I also think there's a lot of ego involved in that. And we all kind of, it's like, what's that story? Collective delusion. The Emperor's New Clothes, it's a bit of an Emperor's New Clothes situation where we all believe that this thing is doing something, but in fact who's calling me? Excuse me, I'm busy. But actually we're kind of in this collective state of delusion that this art thing is doing something, when in fact it's actually us that's doing it. We're animating the spirit or the fuel of this product. It actually ties in well with Tania's point about humans and relationships too, because you know, humans, just as much as the thread used to make this beautiful outfit, humans are also finite. You know, our time, our energy is finite, and so wanting to protect those resources makes just as much sense to me as wanting to protect, or not protect, you know, preserve the amount of cloth you have, I don't know, when you're making something. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. I like to give people pause to like breathe for a sec, and you know, because we're talking about really heavy things here. But yeah, happy to keep talking about that as we move along.
I mean, just to continue the heavy, probably, sorry. I'm thinking a bit about the pandemic, and as we kind of come out the other side of that, and Ruth, I might throw to you first for this one, if that's okay, as I ask this question you haven't heard. But we saw through the pandemic a whole range of experiences really come to light, the precarity, the vulnerability, particularly of artists, of communities of colour, a whole range of people, people who are disabled and have a whole range of access requirements to be able to participate, of course. And we hoped that that experience would have meant that we saw great change across multiple industries, not just the arts, but the not-for-profit sector, the health sector, and so on. And I guess I'm just interested, maybe hopeful, that there might be something happening out there that feels different, but I'd love to hear your perspective on if you think things have changed in any way, or what you've seen sort of happen as a result. And I'd love to hear that from all of you, actually, because you sort of work in different spaces. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
I've got a couple of thoughts, but I wondered if I could just pick up on a couple of threads that crossed my mind when Tania and Adolfo were talking. And one was around refusal, and maybe in some weird way it connects with the pandemic too, but I was thinking about no as being generative. And like, I think there's something that happens when you hit menopause. Anyone know this feeling of menopause? That it's kind of like you don't care quite as much anymore. I don't care as much anymore. I'm also starting to think about what it means to be dispensable and disposable, because there's something that happens as me as a cis woman just sort of acknowledging this movement into another time of life that isn't as hungry, doesn't necessarily want the same kind of attention and interest, doesn't have the same energy to create huge things, but instead wants to be that person that's really supporting, standing behind people who are trying to do things. But yeah, where was I going with that? It'll come back. But yes, I was thinking about what does it mean to say no? No, I'm not going to provide access to this community. No, I'm not going to do this. And oh yes, it's come back to me. The thing about getting older is that I care less about no. I still care because I've grown up as a migrant daughter, wanting very much to be included in a sweet mess, but that has wanted to be included, that has wanted to be acknowledged, and all the kind of token ways that you talked about before, and starting to think, well, actually, no is very powerful, and what will it take for us to say no? And I guess that connects in a vague way, but hopefully there's a thread there about the pandemic, because I think a no was imposed on all of us, and this connects with the conversation about ethics that Tania introduced as she was reading the chapter, and this idea of utilitarianism, which is let's do the thing that has the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people, even though it's a very blunt instrument, even though it will affect people differently. So, lockdowns and other forms of restriction. I don't think we've even begun to kind of really talk about the collective injury that occurred, the collective hurt, the collective compromise, suffering, mental health, and I speak as a mental health nurse that has seen a lot of trauma as well, but I just don't think we've really processed it in a collective, meaningful way, let alone for younger people. That means anyone under 60, by the way. but I don't think we've collectively processed it. And I also think we've collectively not supported the people who really bore the sharpest end of the impacts of the pandemic. And I think the precious lessons that we learned, which was all the issues around accessibility, all the issues around work-life balance, and many others that you named, that could have taken a more structural hold, have been conveniently forgotten. And I'm really, really sad and disappointed about that, because it's kind of like, wow, we forgot. Or the people who were in a position to transform how we live and work and play forgot. Anyway, I'm sorry, that was extremely long-winded, but hopefully vaguely connected.
It's discursive.
That's right.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about no, I had this image, and my primary medium is words, is literature, writer. And the word ecology is used a lot in the arts space, the creative space. We are an ecology. And using ecology as an analogy for practice, for communities, for relationships. Saying no, I think, is a way of allowing the vegetation to regrow. It's allowing certain species to repopulate because there's been an imbalance. So I think it is actually really generative to say no. And then no in a different context, so more specific to my topic in the book, that I think about a lot is this is my term, you can quote me, I've said this a lot in panels. The distinction between a right, like I have a right to something, so a lot of the discourse around identity is we don't get represented enough, we have a right to be seen, we have a right to be heard, etc. I have a right to be on this panel. Or even, I have a right to be invited by X capitalistic organization and I have a right to receive this money, etc. But there's also the concept of rightful, as in, is it rightful for me to say yes? Is it rightful for me to do this? Because from a personal perspective, for example, are you actually burnt out? You have a right to have another opportunity, you have a right to be famous. That was me in 2017. I really wanted to be famous. And in many ways I was. Stopped on the street and stuff by people who saw me at some event, whatever. But I was legitimately burnt out. And I had said yes to too many things, and I was not letting other people, enjoy these opportunities. So it wasn't rightful for me to keep accepting these things. I felt that I had a right to them, legitimately, but it was not rightful. I had to say no. I should have said no. And at the end of that journey, I think, of fame, whatever, selfishness, ego, in 2019 I was burnt out because I had not thought about this notion of rightfulness, in the ways that I am part of an ecology, I'm part of a community. These opportunities are, unfortunately, currently finite because mainstream organizations, the institution, only deign to give us 3 spots, whatever. And I was always saying yes. And the final thing is that, also word-based, is in Spanish there is this verb, aprovechar, which means to capitalize. But if you make it reflexive, as in about yourself, aprovecharse, like to capitalize yourself of something, it's actually to exploit. And it's interesting because capitalize, the word in English, has a similar meaning. We turn a relationship, an experience, whatever, into capital, as in we spend it, we can exploit it, we can waste it. So saying no is super generative. This is what you get from me, word stuff. I hope it's useful.
That reminds me of a saying my mum would remind me of. It's like and again translated into English probably doesn't sound as smooth. But it's like you give your hand and they take your arm. Yeah. So I always try to remember that in the context of no as generative practice. I currently work at CoHealth, Arts Gen. So to bring it back to the question of the pandemic and that perspective. Arts Gen sits under the health promotion branch of CoHealth. CoHealth is a community health organisation. And so I was working there at the time and working there currently when the pandemic, the hard lockdowns were happening. So seeing it from, the health frontline perspective versus the health promotion, health prevention, creative practice perspective was multi-layered. What we were finding was that in 2020 it was shift onto online, and I think there's great things we've learned and maybe not held on structurally to some of those learnings, but we also noted it was keep producing all the time but just do it online. And that was really problematic. Something we did at Arts Gen that tried to slow down the pace a little bit was that we, with a couple of other artists, developed a co-written chapter in a book that was recently released. The chapter was called Practicing Utopias. It was co-written, co-framed, co-edited, co-published with artists Big Wachul. Sophia Kai, Gabriela Georges, John Masha, and Bruno Catalan. And it was published through Dystopian and Utopian Impulses in Art Making. And I know Dr. Ruth De Souza also has a chapter there. So what that looked like was we gathered remotely, so online via Zoom, for 3 sessions, not including the editing part of the process. And we collectively developed a lit review and were responsive to each other's kind of what we wanted to talk about at the time. So yes, there was a provocation from that particular book saying, oh, let's talk about this theme, but we put it to the group and we were like, is this what you want to talk about? Do you want to reframe some of the questions? And we did end up reframing as a group, and those questions became 2 key ones for the group lifetime, which was, what shape does community, art and practice take during times of confinement? The other question was, what does collective care mean during such times? So we had those moments of convergence and then moments of like divergence, is that a word? Like non-convergence. Because at the time we were also getting a little bit sick of Zoom as well. So the group dictated the pace, is what I'm trying to say. And of course, like, I do want to acknowledge that, yes, these artists had a writing practice, and maybe that's a little bit difficult to translate for other practices. But I also want to take this moment to quote Sophia Kai. In this book chapter, she writes, quote, "When lockdown happened and galleries closed, there was a simultaneous sense of, I should be grateful for whatever work I have, but I'm completely burnt out." And I think looking at 2021, 2022, we really started to see the residual or the continual exhaustion of artists. It became really difficult to retain artists, even though we were paying at an equitable rate. It was really difficult to develop projects at the time, because I think, as I said, 2020 was like produce, just do it online, and then we started to really feel that sort of exhaustion 2021, 2022, and we're still feeling it now. And I guess from a stepping back a little bit around the question about health and social determinants of health, we saw a change in the health guidelines after 2020. So where ArtsGen could work in very clearly the social determinants of health, so that for us meant talking about ongoing colonisation, talking about gender-based violence, race-based discrimination and other forms of discrimination, and it gave us a lot of scope to work in really interesting ways. After 2020, those community health promotion guidelines changed to active living, healthy eating, and so that's just 2 examples where it's like, oh, we really need to rethink, and we really needed to be very agile in reframing the work that we were already doing with groups into those frameworks, or challenging those frameworks. So, for example, I work with Yasbel Cacao, who's one of our creative producers at ArtsGen. We worked with a Moiraku group, which is a mixed martial arts Maori form of creative practice, and we worked with them to think about and really challenge the perceptions of that not being active living. So this is the kind of work we're now finding ourselves in, is like now doing trying to work on the perception change while still trying to do projects that really speak with communities, like challenging, or thinking away from that sort of the healthy eating of that that health pyramid of like, you must eat this and that, which was what was, that was the example. This is healthy eating. They put less sugar in your pies, and so now we're finding the work is about that sort of agility. So trying to do that interesting work, but also trying to do that perception change and say, well, cultural response to food is healthy eating. Or this is how we would create a meal for someone who's unwell or someone who's pregnant at the time. So really trying to work in those kind of, trying to be agile in that reframing.
Can I just, I think also underneath all of that, the question of care became really important. And I know that in lots of art circles it was the big buzzword. I was going to say busword. There is no such thing as a busword.
There should be.
There should be a busword, says the person that came off the bus one stop too early on my way here. But so I think we started really thinking about care and who helps the world work when there's a major catastrophe, and people started realizing, oh wow, art is our solace or our escapism or our respite. We depend on the care of so many people who don't have the option to work from home and all those kind of things. But if anyone's interested, I'm working with George over there. We're making a film eventually about a Nurses and Midwives art exhibition that we did. And what we did during the pandemic was invite nurses and midwives to make an expression of what it was like to work in that time, and then match them up with students from RMIT in the undergrad program, which was really incredible. And the students worked with the nurse or midwife and developed a response, which were hung up together in the, I think it's called the Design Hub, I'm forgetting. And at the end of it, the student artist gifted the work to the nurse or the midwife. And we just had the most incredible kinds of conversations about the kind of trauma that people had been through while doing their job, where they stood in for family that weren't allowed to visit, were there as people had their last breaths and said goodbye to their family members on an iPad and these kinds of things. So, I know that lots of nurses and midwives have left their work because it's kind of like that was kind of the last straw for a lot of people. But I do hope that these conversations about care continue, even though we're all operating as if it's business as usual. I mean, I'm still very nervous when I hear someone coughing. It's like, So I think that collective anxiety is still there, not that deeply under the surface if you scratch a bit. But one more thing I wanted to add, and it's kind of, I think these conversations are quite circular and cyclical, was really around power relations, and I think the issue of care, the issue of, if we take it back to some of the projects that you were talking about, Tania, and power relations, these are continuing life conversations. Does making a work change who has power and how they have it? Why are we consuming multiculturalism? And are we making work that fundamentally allows us to ask whose worldviews, whose values, whose beliefs about what the world should look like are being reinforced? Yeah.
Thank you. Heaps to think about and heaps to say. I just want to give a little note to everyone in the room that we're going to throw to you in a moment. So if you have any questions, we'd really love to hear them. I know that it can be a bit terrifying to get your thoughts together, but please, it'd be really wonderful to hear from you if you do have things that you want to hear from the group. I guess just on everything that's been said, I really do see a trend of kind of digression in some ways, and it is very stressful. And I think sometimes, I think a lot about binaries and how unhelpful any kind of binary is, whether it's gender, whether it's art form, whether it's, a healthy eating versus, like a healthy living, anything that we try and put into a box to make sense of. I think we're seeing this collective sort of fight against that in some ways, but it's become more prevalent, more difficult in the context of the sort of wake of the death or the wave of the pandemic. And more, when we think about arts and culture, technically we're supposed to be in the business of art, joy and celebration, storytelling and truth-telling, and how do we really make sure that that is being protected for artists as well. Throughout the pandemic, I was working with the Australia Council, and one artist that I was talking to in a focus group at some point, who we all know who practices in this town and who is extraordinary, and we're so lucky to have him. He said, you know, I thought for the last 30 years that I'd been having a career, but this has made me realise that I'm a body for hire. And I think we really have to think about the casualisation, the precarity and the vulnerability of the people that we look to actually uphold us. And we know that 98% of Australians participate in arts and culture. We know that everybody actually throughout COVID was like, my God, how could I live without art? But how many of us and how many industries and how many individuals are fighting for artists and to safeguard artistic freedom, so that artists can actually also have some sort of stability and ability to be able to...
Universal basic income.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any questions from the floor? Yeah. So can you speak loudly or come forward a little bit?
Yeah, okay, cool. Just a question, just for everyone on the panel. I was just listening to what you were talking about when it came to like how, you know, objectives change, funding objectives can change, and how you had to like, you know, you were doing your work that you knew was important for the community, and then you had to adjust your expectations or adjust your outcomes based on what the funding was looking for. This is a very good question, and I know it's not going to be one answer to this, but if you could design the perfect funding model for what it looks like, what would it be? Is that too much? Is that too big a version?
Universal basic income.
At a minimum.
I like this question more because one of the questions in our pre-panel chat was dreaming about futures. What future, like what's your ideal future? And I recoiled because I don't like dreaming in public contexts, because I get really cynical. You know, like, doesn't matter what I dream about, it's never going to happen. But you're talking about, so you mean specific grant, like funding applications, right? Like kind of funding systems. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll go, because I do this a lot. I think that the fund should explicitly incorporate not just, so care, as in the welfare element of the creator and their collaborators. So by that I mean, I guess like something akin to a universal basic income, or an income that allows them to live. Not just survive, but actually live, including leisure time, including, you know, time to, I know people like these days, watch Netflix or something, or go to Mev, go to my work. Not advertising. On one hand, so as in the human element, but also built in the money so that this creator can then actually present the work in a way that ensures audiences will come. We were talking about the pandemic earlier, and I was going to jump in, but then I got lazy. But I'll do it now. Is that there? I can't remember the name of the study, but there is still a resistance from audiences to come to things, as in to leave their house and pay, as in expend money, but also expend effort on leaving their house to attend events. So thank you for being here. But I think that resistance is partly a trained response to, you know, being at home a lot in the pandemic, and we had to be agile and find leisure or consume art in other ways. Anyway, so this new funding model that we're creating, that I'm devising, will build in some kind of incentive that is actually meaningful for the audience. You know, what will this art transform within me that will be enough for me to get off my couch? Whether that be food and drink, which is always really good, I think, for an audience, whether that be a free talk where the artist is provoked to explain what their work actually means, because we have a suite of work that is so abstract and does not need $100,000 going to the one person making the same work. No shade. And then also I would add in ways of connecting with media, so as in basically what I'm saying is that this funding model has to build in not just the creation of the work, which I kind of hinted at before. It is so exhausting to read artists who have been trained by the old system constantly saying, my work will change minds, my work will allow me to expand my practice so that I can, instead of making sculptures about jugs, make sculptures about cups, and this will make me a better artist. I don't care. Like, literally also no one cares. Why will your audience care? Like, what are you contributing to this, to use that analogy, ecology? What are you contributing to this society? How are you challenging power relations? How are you creating opportunities for other people? That should be built in. That should be in the criteria. And the people assessing should have that trained in them as well to look for these things. Because otherwise we're just recycling the same system that excludes so many people and makes art itself, and I'm talking about art for real now, inaccessible to so many people.
I don't think I can top that, but also just to reiterate around the universal basic income is just we're finding in the arts, it often feels like, oh, here's the next best theme, and now it's the next best theme, and often those themes are very like prescriptive of what community looks like. So not having those restraints in the form like this, as you mentioned, is a way to just find different modalities of working, of being, of breathing, of living, like, and it, you know, I'll also say this a bit later, but I really enjoy creative practices in which someone has to be like, where's the art? And I think there's something interesting about that in relation to universal basic income, but also not necessarily being tied to, and you've mentioned this, the evaluation, like, at ArtsGen, we have a separate role purely for evaluation because it's so much work to evaluate for the health industry, and then you're evaluating for the arts grants that you might have gotten, and then you're also evaluating for the artists that you're working with in the way that they want to evaluate the project. That's a lot of labour.
I guess in answer to your question as well, I'd probably get rid of outcomes altogether in terms of them being articulated at the beginning of a project. Is that not weird? Because aren't you supposed to find that out along the way? And I'd love to see more models like community-supported agriculture, where, you know, there's a whole bunch of people in a community that fund their local farmer to grow their food. I'd really love to see that happen on micro scales across Australia. Like, what would it mean if communities actually funded artists in their community to do stuff that they want to do? And I also think there's some sort of like innate incongruence with government funding in relation to arts, culture, film, screen, creative industries. Because essentially it's truth-telling, and I don't think that match is always right. So we're trying to fit these ideas of freedom of expression and dreams, ambitions, the articulation of life as we know now and in the future and in the past, and have structures fund it that actually are fundamentally disinterested in sharing that. So, I don't know, I'd love to see a divest model where actually most opportunities come through sort of private sources and community sources, acknowledging that there's a big challenge in terms of lived experience and how much money it costs to live in this community these days. But maybe people who have more money pay more, and people who don't have any don't pay at all. Any other questions?
Following on from that, I'd be interested to hear each panelist's relationship to institutions, because it does seem like they're broken, and or the ones we have, but not always. I guess there's pockets of possibility, and I think I got the sense that each of you have experienced pockets, and perhaps that was for Spring Community Arts at that moment. And I wondered if you could maybe talk about what the conditions were and whether we could sort of maybe, I just think that would be a really interesting thing to hear.
I might kick off that response by saying institutions are like budgets. They're not inanimate objects, they're people. And actually people make decisions. So this idea that institutions are not the people in them is sort of a bit of a free, get out of jail free card for people sometimes, because this idea that, the institution says no and the budget says no. It's like actually there's a bunch of people making those decisions, and that is a very personal experience. And I would just wish that we would all take up our place as individuals within the institution and the collective, and also remember that institutions are public places. They belong to the people. They don't belong to the people who are there, paid a salary to serve them, I think for a long time I was of the view that we should work within the structures we have and change them, and I fundamentally believe we should burn them down now.
Wow. Except for this comment.
Except for the comment.
And I don't mean actually burn. I just mean that I don't know that we can get where we want to go if we keep trying to go through the same doors. And up the same set of inaccessible stairs.
Can I just build on that directly? I mean, yes, to an extent, but also I do feel that there is a tendency within certain kinds of institutions, or maybe certain people within certain kinds of institutions, to toe the party line. And I think that's what this question is about, is not, yes, there are people making decisions, but I think when institutions are also hierarchalized, and people having reached a certain position of power like to keep that power, and what that means is they avoid risk. And avoiding risk means towing the party line. It means not letting new people in. It means not changing or challenging what the institution has historically done. And so I think in that way, yeah, it is shorthand. As long as we acknowledge that we're using shorthand, yes, institutions are historically exclusive, oppressive, marginalizing, etc. I am still on that boat of wanting to work from within. I think that's my natural mode. And that is okay. I've often talked about this as a, sorry for the metaphor, as a war, and there are different people contributing different things. By war, I mean not our world's war. I'm often thinking about like in fantasy stories where some people are mages with magic, so that's my role. I influence people by being among them, and I kind of play the long game. I cast spells that change people's minds. I trick people into thinking that they're doing something that is about profit, but maybe this project involves inviting a certain group of people. Maybe I manipulate them by using a concept like identity capitalism and saying, but it's trendy right now to invite like people, diverse people. I use that word that I would never use in any other context, but in that specific moment, it's useful, and so I managed to win that battle through my own sneaky way. But there are people who burn down the institution. They're the paladins. They use swords and weapons and shields and arrows, and that's okay too, But in this war, I feel like different ways of doing things, all kind of ultimately, as long as we have the same goal of challenging the institution / burning down the institution, depending on your perspective. Yeah, I think that's okay. But so mine is my experience very much has been I'm appropriating a term. Whose was it? I cannot remember. I like to quote people. You've all been so dutiful with your quotes. I cannot remember whose idea this was, but this is not mine. The phrase is sneaky seduction. And what it means is, you sneakily seduce your opponent, in this case the institution or whatever term you'd like to use, by, I guess like tempting them, making yourself feel really palatable, really presentable, really innocuous to them. In my case, I perform perfectly my job on my PD. But above and beyond that, or behind that, or around that, or beneath that, I do all these other things that benefit not the institution, but also other people that the institution would otherwise keep excluded. Yeah.
Just to add to that, what I find really useful is not being engulfed in one institution completely, and not being in a dependency model within the one institution, and maybe to also add to this a particular example. So that example that I mentioned earlier around the book chapter that we created in 2020 with the artists, and I would say their researchers as well, what we were able to do by framing that as a creative project as opposed to that project existing within an academic institution was that we were able to pay people as expert artists, basically, and at that fee. Because in a lot of the time, as I'm sure a lot of us know, in academic settings, not only is there a battle about whether that embodied knowledge is valued, but also there's just a lot of free labour happening, unless you're probably even if you're full-time academic, so it's free labour to write that book chapter, write that academic article, and so the interesting thing that we found at ArtsGen is by framing that as an art project within ArtsGen, as opposed to we have ties to universities too, but framing it as an art project in this instant actually meant that we could pay people.
I was going to say, I like what Fred Moten says, which is being in an institution but not necessarily of an institution. And I really love your question. Thank you for asking it, because for me, cultural safety is institutional critique. It's a way of thinking about the culture of the institution. I've kind of got one foot in and one foot out. And for me, I think what's exciting about being in education on a very part-time basis at the moment is the potential to influence the future generation. And I think it's really hard to do that in a considered, long-term, deep kind of way. And so for me, that's still the allure of the university for me, and to engage with ideas and to write and to think. But for me, it's like, can we somehow slow it all down? I want the couch with the cigar in the library, and the comfy chair, and it's just never happened in 20 odd years or whatever it's been. So I guess what I'm interested in is I'm deeply in the institution, but not of it. And I've been in health and I've been in education, which are the ones that I know the best. But I'm interested in, how can we slow everything down? How can we create a margin, some breathing room, some collective reflection, so we can remember that there are people behind the budgets, and have the conversation like, how does this align with our values, and how are we negotiating our own values with the values of all the different kind of levels of accountability that we might encounter, So I'm just really interested in whether there's a way in which we can kind of find spaces that might bounce between Jade and Adolfo's kind of positions, because I'm kind of like, let's burn it as well. But I also think there are resources, there are incredible communities and institutions, so how can we leverage them? And I think part of it is slow time, different kinds of time, putting a pause on. Maybe it's that collective no that I was alluding to, this generative no. We say, actually, we can't do this kind of work anymore, and we want to invest in this kind of work, and we want to support people in this kind of way. So I think that's the potential that I kind of live for. Which keeps me still in there a little bit.
Thank you. Agree with all of that too. We've actually come to time quite rapidly, and to close, I'd really love to hear from each of you about what's your kind of final provocation, thought, share that you would like to give to everyone who's here tonight. So what's the one thing that you really want us all to go away thinking about?
Tania, you're going to say something. You're on the verge.
I was like, do you need a microphone? No, just to add that, just to reiterate, not every relationship needs to be a project. And I really invite you to take that with you and think about the contexts that you're in and the kind of work that you want to make and who you want to make it with.
Mine would be, can we have some more generative no's? And this comes from Eve Tuck, who talks about no as generative.
I'll incorporate something from my background in teaching. I also did a teaching degree, which is you have the what and the how, which is often how we talk about art in practice. But make sure you also think about the why and also the what if, as in what if I do it differently, etc.
Please join me in thanking these wonderful contributors. Lucky to hear from you all tonight, and just really want to thank you for that, because I'm more hopeful just for having shared this space with you, so thank you. I hope you can join us again on Tuesday the 29th of August, where we have a second panel for The Relationship is the Project, second edition. So we'll have some of the new contributors joining us for that. We'll be joined by Tristan Meacham talking about intergenerational queer practice, Timothy O'Connor talking about culturally safe evaluation, Simona Castricum, who's co-written a piece with Dr. CQ Quinnan over there around gender and public space. I'm forgetting someone, and that over there. And Alex Kelly, thank you, talking about climate justice and campaigning. So there's a bunch of, the way that we've curated the second edition is really to invite all of the contributors from this edition to update, change, review in any way that they would like to. Thank you all for doing that in our bit of a hustle time frame. And we've commissioned 12 new pieces as well. So unsurprisingly, there is a bit of a theme around disaster and recovery. Scotia Monkovich. We have Jen Ray and Claire G. Coleman writing about reworlding and climate adaptation. Karina Nolan and Alex Kelly writing about climate justice and campaigning. Kate Larson and I have written about the art of facilitation. Tim is writing about culturally safe evaluation, obviously. We have a piece on deaf practice by Shalini Dagestani, and a bunch of other people, so a bunch of other wonderful people. Thanks again for coming along tonight. It's been really nice to see you here, and I wish you safe travels wherever you're headed. Thanks again.